Well, hello there. Thank you for joining me for Tales and Cocktails. I have my cocktail right here. Now, tonight is a particular... Oh, don't tell me we're having this same trouble with internet connection. I got the message saying, trying to connect, etc. Well, let's just carry on. Where was I? Anyway, it's a particular treat because the story is by P.G. Wodehouse. And the frontispiece to this particular collection of his stories, called Young Men in Spats, describes him thus: the author of almost 100 books and the creator of Jeeves, Blandings Castle, Uxbridge, P.G. Wodehouse was born in 1881 and educated at Dulwich College. After 2 years with the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, he became a full-time writer, contributing to a variety of periodicals, including Punch and The Globe. He married in 1914. As well as his novels and short stories, he wrote lyrics for musical comedies with Guy Bolton and Jerome Kern, and at one time had 5 musicals running simultaneously on Broadway. His time in material for fiction. At the age of 93, in the New Year's Honors List of 1975, he received a long overdue knighthood, only to die on St. Valentine's Day, some 45 days later. So this is the wonderful P.G. Wodehouse. And my dears, I'm getting that message again that there's trouble with the connection with the internet. I don't know what this is about, but I'm just going to keep reading. So this particular short story by the delicious P.G. Wodehouse is entitled, Our little group of serious thinkers in the bar parlor of the Angler's Rest had been discussing a breach of promise case to which the papers were giving a good deal of prominence at the moment, and a whiskey sour had raised the question of how these fellas did it. Tell a girl it's all off, I mean, said the whiskey sour. It must take the courage of a lion. I was a daring sort of young chap in my prime, but if you had told me to go to my dear wife, Miss Bootle, she was then, one of the East Balham Bootles, and cast her aside like a soiled nerve. Yet apparently it's happening every day. Odd. A thoughtful eggnog said that he understood that the telephone was a great help on these occasions. A gin and ginger preferred what he called the good old false beard method. It solves the whole problem, said the gin and ginger. You get your false beard, then you write the girl a letter, then you slip on the beard and go to Nova Scotia. A half of stout said that wasn't British. The gin and ginger said yes, it was very British. The half of stout appealed to Mr. Mulliner. Would you do that, Mr. M? If you were engaged to a girl and wanted to break it off, would you buy a false beard? Mr. Mulliner smiled indulgently. As in that of any member of my family, he said, sipping his hot scotch and lemon, the question of how to break off an engagement would never arise. We may be wrong, we may be foolishly jealous of the noblesse oblige of an ancient name, but the code of the Mulliners is that an engagement cannot be broken off by the male contracting party. When a Mulliner plights his troth, it stays plighted. It's a chivalry handed down to him by a long line of ancestors that so complicated matters for my nephew Archibald when he wished to be free of his honorable obligation to Amelia Camerley. We were stunned. Archibald? We cried. Your nephew Archibald? The one who imitated hens? But we thought he worshipped the girl with the utmost fervor. He did. Then why did he want to break the engagement? I need scarcely say that his motives, as the motives of any nephew of mine could not fail to be, were in the light and altruistic. he conceived himself to be acting entirely in Aurelia's best interests. But perhaps you would care to hear the story. You remarked just now, said Mr. Mulliner, that my nephew Archibald worshipped Aurelia Camerley with the utmost fervor, and that is precisely what he did worship her with. Her lightest word was law to him. A smile from her made his day. When I tell you that not once, but on 3 separate occasions, he sent his man, Meadows, out into the park with instructions to carve his, Archibald's, initials and those of Miss Camerley on the nearest convenient tree with a heart round them, you will understand something of the depths of his feelings. And why, when, after they had been betrothed some 6 weeks, he found her manner towards him growing definitely cold. He was shaken to the core. I don't know what is happening here. I'll just keep going. It's all I can think of to do. He was shaken to the core. Now, mere temporary and fleeting demonstrations of frigidity on the part of the adored object are, of course, not unusual. Girls affect them simply in order to enjoy the luxury of melting again. But this was different. This had all the... He would call her the lodestar of his life. And she would say, "Ho hum." He would inquire of her if she loved her little Archibald, and she would say, "Hi ho." He would speak of their coming wedding day, and she would ask him if he had read any good books lately. Trifles, you may say. Nothing tangible, I grant, but nevertheless, taking this with that and weighing all the evidence, Archibald Mulliner became convinced that for some mysterious reason his Aurelia had at length, as every young man should do when his heart is aching, he decided to go and ask the advice of his mother. Archibald's mother, since her widowhood, had taken up her abode in the neighborhood of Kew. Between her and Aurelia there had sprung up a warm friendship, and it occurred to Archibald that in the course of one of their chats together, the girl might possibly have let fall some remark which would provide a clue to the mystery. A speculative venture to pop round and inquire. So he unleashed his 2-seater and presently was making his way through the little garden to the sunlit room at the back of the house where his mother liked to sit of an afternoon. And he was just about to step through the open French windows with a filial pip-pip when a sudden sight sent him back on his heels, and he stood gaping, his eyeglass cast adrift in his emotion, bobbing like some live thing at the end of its cord. For there, gentlemen, in that sunlit room, relic of the late Sir Sholto Mulliner, M.V.O., with her tongue out like a dog's, panting in deep gasps, with a sort of horrible ha sound that turned the blood in Archibald's veins to ice. And then, as he watched, she suddenly stopped panting and began to utter a remark which, even by Archibald's not too exacting standards, seemed noticeably goofy. It consisted repeated over and over again. And as Archibald has often told me, it was the way she said them that got right in amongst a fellow. The cue, he tells me, was an almost inaudible murmur produced through pouting lips. That, he says, he could have endured. What made everything seem so sad and hopeless was the X. As she emitted this, she drew her mouth back in a ghastly grin till the muscles of her neck stood out like ropes, and she went on and on. She refrained from cueing the cue only to X the X, and she wasn't Xing to beat the band. She was cueing away like a 2-year-old. That was how my nephew Archibald displayed that it conjures up a vivid picture. Well, of course, Archibald understood now why Aurelia's manner toward him had changed of late. Obviously, she must have come upon the poor old parrot unexpectedly in the middle of one of these spells of hers, and perceived, as he did, that she was as loony as a coot, enough to make any girl think a bit. He turned away and staggered out of the garden with blind steps. One can, of course, appreciate his agony, poor lad. Few things are less pleasant for a young man in the springtime of his life than to have a well-loved mother suddenly go off her rocker. And when such a tragedy involves the girl he worships, you've got something that Somerset Maugham could make a 3-act play out of without conscious cerebration. For he realized, of course, that his engagement would have to be broken off. A man of nice scruples like Archibald Mulliner could have no option. A chap, he meant to say, can't go lugging girls off to the altar if there is insanity in his family. Apart from anything else, this pottiness was probably coming out in himself, too, before he knew where he was. And a nice thing it would be for Aurelia if, as they stood side by side in the sacred edifice, and the clergyman said, "Wilt thou, Archibald?" he were to reply, "QX." Or worse, pant like a dog with his tongue out. All sorts of remarks it would cause. A girl in such circumstances could scarcely help but feel pretty silly. He must break the engagement at once. And then, suddenly, even as he framed the thought, there rose up before him the recollection of the code of the Mulliners, and he saw that the whole affair was going to be a good deal more difficult and complex than he had supposed. He could not break the engagement. He would have to do something to make Aurelia take that step. But what it now boiled down to was, what? He mused. What girls of his acquaintance had broken off their engagements, and why? There was Jane Todmarsh. Her betrothed, taking her, had driven it, her, and himself into a duck pond out Hitchin way. She had given the young man his freedom within 2 seconds of spitting the first newt out of her mouth. Suppose he were to take Aurelia for a drive, and... No, he shrank from it. He couldn't say why exactly, but he shrank from it. Millie Salt had returned her fiancé to store because of his habit of uttering a short every time she missed a shot in the mixed doubles. No help for Archibald here. Aurelia did not play tennis. Besides, he knew that in no circumstances could he bring himself to snigger dryly and nastily at one who was to him more like some sort of goddess than anything. The case of Hypatia Slockett was different. A former flame of the future lord and master had turned up in the middle of dinner one night at the Savoy and made a row. This, Archibald felt, was the best bet yet. There was the difficulty that he had no former flames, but a moment's thought told him that he could easily go round to such one. There were probably 100 out-of-work actresses in the Strand neighborhood who would be delighted to come in on the deal for a fiver. And yet, once again, he found himself shrinking. That sort of thing happening in a crowded restaurant could not fail to make a fellow feel pretty dashed conspicuous, and he hated feeling conspicuous. If there was any other alternative, he would vastly prefer to take it. That he remembered Dora Trevis. On the eve of becoming Mrs. Aubrey Rochester Wapshott, she had notified the Morning Post that the fixture was off, and the whole trouble, Archibald recalled, had been caused by poor old Aubrey getting a bit pie-eyed at the family dinner table and insulting her father. There was the solution. he would insult old Cammerly and leave the rest to Aurelia. Not but what, felt Archibald, it was going to take some doing. This those mild old men who make nice, easy insulting. He was a tough, hard-bitten, retired colonial governor of the type which comes back to England to spend the evening of its days barking at club waiters. And until now it had been Archibald's prudent policy to conciliate him to the utmost. With sedulous assiduity, he had always bent himself to the task of giving Sir Rackstraw Cammerly the old referred to his opinions. He had smirked meekly, infusing into his manner a rather revolting reverence. Above all, he had listened raptly to his stories, caring little that a certain eccentricity of memory sometimes led the ex-proconsul to tell the same one 4 evenings in succession. By these means, he had so succeeded in ingratiating himself with the old blighter that a sudden reversal of policy would have all the greater effect. One bold effort, and it seemed to Archibald that the whole subject of wedding bells must inevitably be removed from the agenda paper, but resolute. My nephew dressed himself with his usual care and set off to dine en famille at his loved one's home. I do not know if any of you gentlemen have ever watched a retired colonial governor at his evening meal. I have not had the experience myself, but Archibald tells me it is one fraught with interest. He begins, it seems, in a spirit rather similar to that of the lion of the jungle at feeding time, growling fiercely over his soup, absorbing his fish to the accompaniment of a series of muffled snarls. It is only with the entree that a softer mood starts to manifest, and onward through the joint and suite, one is aware of a growing geniality. The first animal hunger has abated. Repletion has done its kindly work. With the dessert and port, the now mellow subject leans back and starts to tell stories. It was so that it happened tonight. Bagshot, the butler, filled his employer's glass and stepped back into the shadows. And Sir Rackstraw, grunting not unaimed, bulging eye. Had he been a man to take notice of such phenomena, he would have seen that the young man was white and tense and wore a strung-up look. But if there was one thing in this world that did not interest Sir Rackstraw Cammerly, it was the play of expression on the face of Archibald Mulliner. He was regarding him now purely in the light of a recipient of his story of old George Bates and the rhinoceros. Being a full moon tonight, he began, for it was on this subject that Archibald had just hazarded a remark. Reminds me of a curious thing that happened to an old friend of mine out in Bongo Bongo, old George Bates. He paused to sip at his glass, and Archibald saw that Aurelia's face had grown tired and hard. Her mother, too, a pale, worn woman, uttered a stifled little sigh. Somewhere in the background he could hear Bagshot stirring uneasily. At the time of the full moon, resumed Sir Rackstraw, it is the custom in Bongo Bongo to hunt the rhinoceros. And this friend of mine, George Bates his name was. Oh, by the way, stop me if I've told you this before. Stop, said Archibald. There was a tense silence. Sir Rackstraw was quivering as if the word had been a bullet, and he the rhinoceros, which in his less cordial moods he somewhat resembled. What did you say? He rasped. I said stop, replied Archibald. Though quaking inwardly, he preserved an outward firmness, even a sort of truculence. You told me to stop you if I had heard it before, and I stopped you. I have heard that story 6 times before. Even if it were good, I wouldn't like it. but it is not good. It is rotten, and I shall be extremely obliged, Carmelie, either now or at any other time when you may feel the urge. I never wish to hear of Bates and his rhinoceros again, and I couple with the name of this rhinoceros the names of any other rhinoceri you or your friends may have encountered in your exceptionally tedious past. You understand me, Carmelie? Enough is enough. He stopped and helped himself to port. At the same moment, he pushed his chair back a little, prepared, should events so shape themselves as to render such a course advisable, to slide under the table, and there defend himself with tooth and claw. A stoutish ex-colonial governor, he reasoned, would find it pretty hard to get at a fellow who had a table. It was as he reached this decision that Lady Carmelie spoke. "Thank you, Archibald," she said, and there were tears in her faded voice. "It is about time some tough bimbo came along and spoke those brave words. You have said just what I have been wanting to say for years. This would have made the 127th time I have heard the story of George Bates and the rhinoceros. I've heard it 43 times, she said. There was a decorous cough in the shadows. And I, said Bagshot the butler, 86. May I take the liberty of adding my humble tribute of gratitude to Mr. Mulliner for the firm stand he has taken? I sometimes think the gentlemen do not realize how distressing it is for a butler to have to listen to their after-dinner stories. His official position, involving, as it does, the necessity of standing with his back against the sideboard, renders escape impossible. It makes a butler's life very wearing, very wearing. Thank you, Mr. Mulliner. Not at all, said Archibald. Thank you, Archibald, said Lady Carmelie. Archibald. Thank you, dear, said Archibald. Only too pleased, said Archibald. You are now, father. You see now, father, said Aurelia, turning to Sir Rackstraw, why you are shunned at the club. The proconsul stared. I'm not shunned at the club. You are shunned at the club. It's all over London. Well, I believe you are right, said Sir Rackstraw thoughtfully. Now you mention it, fellows have shunned me at the club. I see it all now. I was degenerating into a club bore. And thanks to the fearless candor of this fine young fellow here, my eyes have been opened. I see the light. Bagshot, charge the glasses. My dear, have you port? Aurelia, you? Then I give you my future son-in-law, Archibald Mulliner, who has rendered me a service this night which I can never sufficiently repay. And now, Aurelia, my dear, as we have finished our simple evening meal, perhaps you take a stroll round the square. As he so justly observed a moment ago, chuckled Sir Rackstraw, there is a full moon. Out in the moonlit square, Aurelia was all remorse and worshipping admiration. Oh, Archibald, she cried as she pressed against his arm, I feel so awful. You must have noticed how cold I have been of late. It was because you were so meek and worm-like with father. I recognize, of course, that he is a man who chews tenpenny nails and swallows brandy to think that you should be afraid of him. You were my wonder man, and it seemed during those awful days that I had been mistaken in you, that you had failed me. And all the while, you were simply biding your time, preparatory to slipping it across him properly. I really do think, darling, that you are the most marvelous man on earth. Well, Archibald said, "No, I say, really, thanks awfully." But it was in a dull, toneless voice that he said it. The hideous irony of his position was weighing sorely on the young man. Here he was, adored, one might say fawned upon, by this lovely girl. It impossible that he should marry her. And if you could tie that, even in a Russian novel, he would like to know how. "Tomorrow," said Aurelia, "you shall take me to dine at the Savoy, and we'll celebrate." "Right-ho," said Archibald absently. He was wondering where the best theatrical agency was. It was at 11:30 next morning that Archibald stood with reluctant feet halfway up the dark staircase that leads to the offices of Isidore McCallan, the well-known agent who has told more people that he will write and let them know if anything turns up than any other man of his profession in London. His mood was Hamlet-like. Reason told him that this thing had got to be done, but as he told reason, nobody was going to make him like it. And so he hesitated. And it was while he was still hesitating that there came from above the sound of a slammed door and the noise of rushing feet. A moment later, a solid body had struck him, and in its company, inextricably entwined, he fell the half-flight of stairs that ended in the street door. It was only when this frail barrier had given way before their combined weights, and he was sorting himself out upon the pavement, that he perceived what had caused all this anxiety was a stout young woman in pink with peroxide hair. For a few moments, she out of one who has recently passed through some great ordeal. Then she spoke. "Did I bump you, dearie? I'm sorry." "Not at all," said Archibald courteously, straightening with his right hand a rib that seemed to have got a little bent. "I wasn't looking where I was going." "It's quite all right." "And who would have been looking where they were going after being insulted by a worm?" demanded the woman. Archibald, ever sympathetic, clicked his tongue. "Did a worm insult you?" "You bet a worm insulted me." "Worms will be worms," suggested Archibald. This tolerant viewpoint seemed to give offense. "Not while I have my... Listen, what do you think that man up there said to me? Said I was too stout to play heroines in the No. 2 towns." She sniffed bitterly. "Well, you can't be too stout for the No. 2 towns. The thing isn't possible. They like the heroines stout. It makes them feel they've had their money's worth." This buxom beauty, Lester Argus. "I beg your pardon?" "I was saying what the Lester Argus said about me. My Geraldine, in twisted life." Paul's intellect, such as it was, began to assert himself. He had been a little shaken by his fall. "Do you play heroines in melodramas?" he asked eagerly. "Do I play heroines in melodramas?" she echoed. "Do I play heroines in melodramas? Do I play heroines in melodramas?" Why, Archibald saw that she did. "I say," he said, "how about stepping up to the bodega for a small port? I've a little business proposition." She seemed suspicious. Her gaze, unlike her waist measurement, was narrow. "Business? Strictly business. You don't want to cover me with jewels?" "Absolutely not." "Well then, I don't mind if I do," she said, relieved. "You've no notion how careful a girl has got to be these days," she added. "I've had many guilty splendor on the strength of my having accepted a bath bun and a small cocoa at their hands." "Baronets?" asked Archibald, for he had heard that there was a good deal of moral laxness among that class. I think so, said his companion, disguised. And so, chatting amiably, they passed into the fragrant coolness of the bodega. I have little or no acquaintance among the pure and beefy ladies who play heroines in our number 2 towns, said Mr. Mulliner, so I am unable to say whether Miss Yvonne Maltravers, for such was the name on the professional card which she handed to my nephew, or whether intelligence like hers is the rule or norm in those circles. Suffice it to say that she not only grasped his position, as he explained it, with lightning celerity, but seemed to find nothing unusual in a young man being in such a position. And Archibald, who had anticipated a good deal of tedious explanation, was enchanted by her quickness at the uptake. Then you follow the scenario, he said. You see what I'm driving at. You really will breeze along to the Savoy tonight and play the role of a betrayed girl? Miss Maltravers coughed. Betrayed, dearie. I've always kept my art clean and always shall. You don't read the Buxhill Gazette, do you? She is purity personified, it said. I put it in my professional ads for a time. That was when I was Myrtle in the Hand of Doom. If you will allow me to make a suggestion, we're all working for the good of the show. I'd say, let me be someone unspotted who's bringing a breach of promise action against you. That's just as good, you think? It's better, said Miss Maltravers firmly. It's the duty of all of us in these licentious post-war days to put our hands to the plow and quench the flame of this suggestiveness. I've thought that 100 times, said Archibald. I've thought it a couple of 100, said Miss Maltravers. Then that's fine, said Archibald, rising. I'll expect you at the Savoy Grill round about 9:15. You come in, enter, corrected Miss Maltravers. That's right, left. I always enter left. It shows up my best profile. And you accuse me of having trifled with your affections in a nice way, in a perfectly nice way. Where would you, said Miss Maltravers with decision, and I'll tell you why. My affections actually were trifled with in Middlesbrough once, so it'll help me give colour and movement to the scene. When I remember Bertram, that was his name, Bertram Lussington. I put him over my knee and gave him a good spanking. That won't be necessary tonight, will it? Asked Archibald, a little anxiously. Of course, I don't want to interfere with your conception of the role, or whatever you call it. It's how I see the part. Dress trousers are dashed thin, you know. Very well, said Miss Maltravers regretfully. Just as you like, only. Thanks awfully. I'll tell you one thing that's going to be a great help, said Miss Maltravers, brightening. The whole scene's very like my big second act smash in His Forgotten Bride, except that was at the altar rails. You wouldn't prefer to postpone production till we can get an altar rail set? No, I think we'd better rush the thing through tonight. Just as you say. It'll mean making a few line cuts, but most of the speeches will fit in. You won't mind if I call you a heartless cur who should blush to think that he sullies the grand old name of Englishman? Not at all. It got around at Eastbourne. All right, then. 9:15 on the dot, said Archibald. It might be supposed that now that everything had been so satisfactorily arranged, my nephew Archibald would have felt relieved. But such was not the case. As he sat toying with his food at the Savoy that night, the reflection that he had done his duty like a Mulliner was not enough to keep him from experiencing a hideous depression and apprehension. One paid dearly, he mused, for the traditions of his race. How simple it would have been for one who was not a Mulliner to write Aurelia a letter, severing their relations, and then go abroad somewhere and lie low till the thing had blown over. Instead of which, here he was, faced with the prospect of disgrace and shame and acquaintances. He had always been so proud of his reputation. He had liked to think that, as he walked about London, people pointed him out and whispered, "That's Mulliner, the chap who imitates hens." From tonight, the formula would be changed. It would be, "Look, see that bird? That's Mulliner. The fellow who was mixed up in that priceless scene at the Savoy Grill." A bitter reflection, rendered none the more pleasant by the thought it was quite possible that, carried away by her art, his accomplice might forget their gentleman's agreement and spank him after all. It was with a distrait ear, therefore, that he listened to Aurelia's conversation. She was a laugh often rang out over the din and chatter, and every time it did so, it seemed to go right through Archibald like an electric drill. He looked about him and shuddered at what he saw. Somehow, when he had first conceived this masquerade, he had visualized it as taking place in what Miss Maltravers would have described as a set, occupied only by himself and Aurelia. But tonight, the whole muster roll of his acquaintance seemed to be present. Over there sat the young Marquis of Hampshire, who did the gossip for the Daily Tribune. 2 tables beyond, he saw the young Duke of Datchet, who did the gossip for the Daily. These, at least half a dozen more earls, barons, viscounts, and baronets, who did the gossip for a half dozen more journals. He would be sure of an extended, if not a good, press. And then suddenly occurred something which seemed to him positively to put the saucepan cover on it. Through the door, accompanied by an elderly gentleman of military aspect, came his mother. Stage by this time, and he tells me that he distinctly felt those sardines turn to ashes in his mouth. He had always loved and respected his mother, even after circumstances had so arranged himself as to convince him that she was leaky in the overhead valves, and the thought that she would be a witness of tonight's scene gashed him like a knife. Dimly, he realized that Aurelia was saying something to him. He said. I said, "There's your mother. She's looking ever so much better, don't you think?" "Better?" "She was worried," explained Aurelia, "because she was getting a double shin. I found her in floods of tears one afternoon, trying to work it off with a squeegee. Absolutely no good, of course, and I told her so. There's only one thing for a double shin, and that's this new method everybody's going in for these days. First, you stand and pant like a dog for 20 minutes. This hardens the throat muscles. Then you breathe deeply and keep saying QX, QX over and over again. The Q isn't so important, but the X is the goods. It works directly on the chin and neck, tightening them up." The room seemed to be rocking about Archibald. "What?" "Absolutely," said Aurelia. "You've got to be careful, of course, at first. Otherwise, you're extremely apt to dislocate your neck or something." "Do you mean to tell me," demanded Archibald, choking, "that all that QX stuff I saw her doing was simply one of these ballet modern beauty drill things? Oh, did you see her? It must have given you rather a shock, I should think." "The first time I saw my aunt doing it, I was on the phone ringing up doctors to come on the run and certify her before you could say, 'What ho!'" Archibald leaned back in his chair, breathing heavily. For a moment, all he could feel against the fate that wrecks our lives. as far as one can see, in a spirit of pure whimsicality. A fat lot of good it was, he felt, acting from the best motives in this world. Then his resentment extended itself to woman. Woman, he felt, simply ought not to be allowed loose. You never knew what they were going to do next. Himself, he realized that he knew quite well what one woman at least was going to do next. Miss Yvonne Maltravers was going to come entering left and telling him that he was sullying the grand old name of Middlesbrough, or whatever it was. He looked at his watch. The hands pointed to 15 minutes past 9. Of course, if it's a question of reducing the tummy, said Aurelia, that's different. You have to go down on all fours and crawl around the room saying, oofa, oofa. I say, she broke off, and her silvery laugh rang through the room once more. You do get all sorts in these eating houses nowadays. Look at that weird female by the door. Archibald followed her gaze, and his heart did two double Maltravers who stood on the threshold, or, as she would no doubt have preferred to put it herself, in the downstage OP entrance. She was peering about her at the tables. Seems to be looking for someone, said Aurelia. If some sporting hand had suddenly introduced a bradawl into the seat of my nephew Archibald's trousers, he could not have risen with more celerity. There was, he told himself, just one hope. It might lead to a certain amount of talk, but if he were to place one hand over Miss Maltravers' mouth and, seizing the slack of her dress with the other, rush her out the way she had come, dump her into a cab, tell that cab to drive to Shepherd's Bush, and on the way thither drop the talented artiste out the window into a convenient basement, he might yet be saved. Might excite comment. Aurelia, no doubt, would raise her eyebrows in a mute demand for an explanation. But he could always say that it was one of those new slimming exercises designed to strengthen the triceps muscles and remove superfluous fat from the upper chest. More like a puma of the African hinterlands than a Mulliner, Archibald sped across the room, and Miss Maltravers, sighting him, spoke. Oh, Mr. Mulliner, I was looking for you. To Archibald's surprise, she spoke in a whisper. At their previous meeting in the bodega, her voice had been full and robust, so much so that nervous fellow customers had twice complained. But now she was more like a leaky gas pipe than anything Archibald could think of. Method of delivery seemed to cause her pain. She winced distinctly. I wanted to tell you, dearie, she proceeded, still in that same strange, hushed voice, that there's been a sort of hitch, if you know what I mean. The fact is, like a silly girl, taking these harsh words of Mr. McCallum's too much to heart, I started trying one of these new exercises for reducing the chin this afternoon that a lady friend happened to tell me of. You may have heard of it. It's the one where you say QX, and it was all right for X's, but I wasn't more than halfway through the third X when something suddenly seemed to go crack in my throat, and now I can't speak except in a whisper without feeling as if I were being torn asunder with pincers. So there it is, dearie. I hate to disappoint my public, a thing I've never done in my life before. This loyal artist, Wolverhampton Express. So I'll go on if you like, but I warn you it won't be the same thing. I shan't be able to do myself what you might call justice. That part wants playing, and a girl can't give of her best in a whisper. Why, once in Peebles, I cracked a couple of footlights. Hey, if you'd like me to walk the scene, I will. For a moment, Archibald could not speak. It was not so much that his mouth was still full of sardines on toast, as that he was overpowered, unmanned by a rush of emotion such as he had not experienced since the day when Aurelia Camerley had promised to be his. "Don't dream of it," he urged. "It won't be necessary. Owing to is off. You go straight home, old soul, and rub liniment on yourself. I'll send you a check in the morning. It's just about here that it seems to catch me." "I'll bet it does," said Archibald. "Well, pip-pip, toodle-o, cheerio, and God bless you. I shall watch your future career with considerable interest." With feet that hardly seemed to touch the floor, he returned to his table. Aurelia was puzzled and curious. "Did you know her?" she asked. "Oh, yes," said Archibald. "Old nurse of mine." "What did she want?" "Just cake." "But it isn't your birthday." "No, but you know what these old nurses are." "Now tell me, my precious angel dream rabbit," said Archibald, "this wedding of ours. My idea is to rope in a couple of bishops and do the thing right. Not one bishop, if you see what I mean, 2 bishops. Because if you have a spare, nothing can go wrong. And nowadays, when you see people straining their throats on all sides, you can't afford to take any chances." And there we are. The wonderful, wonderful Pelham Grenville Wodehouse. Oh my, I don't know if we reconnect due to poor internet connection. This red thingy comes up in the middle of the screen, and here we are again. I hoped it would have lost itself by this week. Yeah. 1 week was quite sufficient time to straighten itself out, but I'll think about trying to change position for next week and see what we can do. Anyway, thank you for being with me. Always a pleasure to read P.G. Wodehouse. Such a delight, and what a wonderful way with words, with the English language. It is impeccable. And just, it's like singing in a song in that everything is in the right place. It is music. So anywho, enough of this. Thank you so much for being with me. I look forward. Bye for now.